before you ever show anything to the lenders, you want to have scrubbed those numbers first. The lender comes in and essentially penalizes you. And you're like, wait a minute, my owner-operator doesn't have management. He's going to do it himself. They're going to run those numbers for you, and they're going to back in another really important number, often quite large. Hey there, I'm going to take a deep dive with you into property operating expenses, OpEx, as they commonly call it. So I think this is really important because in my experience dealing with all different types of real estate properties, but especially the smaller properties, many expenses get overlooked. They just get kind of left out. They think they're not involved in smaller properties, and sometimes they are and sometimes they're not. But I want you to be aware of all the different types of real estate expenses that go into a commercial real estate property. Now I'm going to be looking specifically at how a multifamily property operates. There are going to be differences across all the different asset types. I think you would really need to do a deeper dive and have some local expertise about a self-storage property, how a retail or an office or a hotel property are going to operate. Hotel specifically is going to be dramatically different. But in general, besides hotels, the other operating classes are all going to operate in roughly the same way. So I want to get in here just by kind of identifying where the biggest problems lie, because there are a lot of hidden factors. A lot of numbers can be massaged, hidden, finagled, I don't know, whatever word you want to use. And it's important to identify where those nuances could be so that you as a real estate mortgage professional or a financing professional can be on the lookout for them. And you can know where to ask deeper dive questions. Look, I've been on the phone many times with asset managers working for an equity company or for a lender. And depending on who they are and their level of sophistication, if they've never been owner-operators of property, I can tell pretty quickly. Because they'll ask one layer of questions, but they don't go to the second or third layer deep of the questions, especially very often with foreign investors who are investing in equity in American property. They just don't know to go into that second and third layer deep. But you as a mortgage professional should. You should at least be aware of it. Whether you choose to take that deep of a dive into what your borrower is presenting you, because think about it, the borrower is going to be presenting you information that they have. If it's a purchase, very often they found or they got their information from the seller. So they've asked the seller, hey, can you provide us with historical financial statements, right? And historical operating statements and copies of your utilities and copies of your real estate tax bills. And it's your job or it's the borrower's job to go through all that, to kind of put all of that in an organized way, hopefully in some kind of a presentation, and give that to you. And you're going to need to give it to the lenders. So the whole point of this entire talk is that before you ever show anything to the lenders, you want to have scrubbed those numbers first. You want to make sure, first and foremost, that the borrower is aware of all the information that they have about their property, that the borrower has thought this through and is aware of how has the seller operated the property, how is the borrower going to be operating the property, because they're not always the same. The quickest and easiest example would be property management. Perhaps the seller was self-managed. He did all the work himself. He showed up on Tuesdays and Friday mornings and swept, the laundry and swept the building and took out the garbage. You might say, no way, I'm a new owner operator, I'm a new borrower, I have no intention of doing that. We're bringing in third-party management and staff to handle all of that. That's going to be a dramatic difference. So that's just an example. We're going to go through more of them in depth, but the borrower needs to have a good understanding of how they're going to operate the property and how that's going to change from the seller. And then you want to make sure you go through their numbers and that you have support and rationale for all the changes that they're making. What do I mean by changes? There are going to be some historical information. It might be a trailing 12. Which means a trailing 12 months. So let's say you're buying the property in September. Trailing 12 months would be, the previous 12 months going back to last October versus a full year, January to December 31st, right? That's a full year. Versus any kind of in between. Oh, we only have 6 months worth of operating expenses. Okay, well, what are you going to do with 6 months? What period are those 6 months from? And are they complete? So we're going to have to take a look at that. The bottom line is the goal here, the goal as a financier, the goal as a mortgage broker, or even as a borrower for sure, is that you want to maximize your loan proceeds. To maximize your loan proceeds, you need to show the greatest, highest NOI. To show the greatest, highest NOI, you want to show the minimum amount of expenses and the most amount of income. But you have to be able to support all those numbers. So this is where a gray line really exists. you as the borrower or the broker working for the borrower, you may be aware that these aren't the actual historical numbers, or these aren't even the numbers that the borrower thinks they're really going to operate, but these are the numbers that I can justify to the lender based on normal operating expenses for a property like this, and therefore that might help me maximize proceeds. It's a fine gray line. I've seen companies that kind of really do maneuver the numbers. I've seen companies that are absolutely straight with the numbers that they present to a lender. You need to make that distinction for yourself. I personally believe you should always just show the straight, honest, up-to-date truth, because things tend to get found out during a deep dive that most lenders will take nowadays. And with computers and more sophisticated things being digital, it's hard to hide things. It used to be a lot easier. I'll give an example. It used to be, for it's a small example, laundry revenue. So you're in a multifamily property and they have a coin-operated laundry machine. Very common was the borrower would just hold that money. It wouldn't show up. Or they would report $25 when they really made $500. And that's just cash. It's not a lot of money, so it was never a big deal. Lenders knew what was going on, didn't really care that much. But nowadays, everything's electronic. You get a card, you get a card, prepaid with a little stamp on it, not a stamp, a chip in it. It's hard to hide that stuff because it's all electronic nowadays. Similarly with utility reimbursements. It used to be that utility reimbursements might be something that comes off the rent in cash. Sometimes people would walk into the office and just give somebody a personal check or cash to cover the utility reimbursements. Nowadays, it's usually all done by third-party electronic processors. You can't really hide anything. So my suggestion is don't try. And if you think that your borrower is trying to hide something, be upfront with that. Have the conversation with them, and you'll make the decision with them. Okay, without further ado, let's dive in. So I've put these three little illustrations up here, and I am not an artist, and I'm sorry to say that I'm not an artist. I will tell you this, my mother, not so wonderful to talk about your mother on a video, my mother is an artist, and so I'm ashamed to say that I didn't get any of her skills or talent. I've put three things up here. Number one would be a clock. This one is my hand, and this one is a vault. So let's talk about why I put these three and not 50 others. Besides the fact that I can't draw very well. Why the clock? Well, we already touched on this a little bit. I'm trying to illustrate with the clock to get you to visually think about the fact that a lot of the expense items have a time component to them. What I mean by that is a seasonal component to them. For example, real estate taxes often get charged once a year. Different counties are going to do that at different times of the year. Let's say it's May. Well, if somebody sent you the trailing 6 months of expenses, and it didn't include the month of May, you're not going to see the real estate taxes in there. Does that mean there aren't any real estate taxes on the property? I can most assuredly guarantee you there are real estate taxes on every property that you're looking at. Why aren't they in there? Because it was a different time of the year that wasn't covered in the information that was provided. So that's important. Let's take another example. And for this, I guess I'll go down here. Let's take another example. It could be utilities. Different properties are going to have different costs for utilities. Perfect example, Florida or anywhere in the south of the country that has high air conditioning expenses throughout the summer season and really all year round for many of these areas. Contrast that to the Northeast or the Midwest, right? Where in the winter you're going to have a lot of heating. Oil, could be oil, could be gas, could be electric heating. All that's going to be substantially increased in the winter and non-existent in the summer. So you need to be aware of different utility expenses based on the time of the year. Really important to be aware of that. And that takes into account not just the time of the year, but the location of the property. And that's why if you could have stats from IREM, I-R-E-M, I think, Industry of Real Estate Managers, I forget what IREM stands for. They publish these numbers, especially for multifamily, where they have stats on different property types in different locations, different aging and classes, kind of giving you the metric of those different utility values, or really all expenses across different types of properties. I'm not suggesting that you need to do that. It's always a good benchmark, but you really don't need it. You have the historical numbers, which is why you want to see complete years. You don't want a trailing 6. You're happy with a trailing 12. You're happy with a full year. You'd like to get 1, 2, or 3 years worth to see the different variances. Similarly, utilities into grounds. Obviously, you might have snow removal in the winter. You might have leaves and more greenery. You would expect landscaping to be much higher in a place like Florida than it might be in the Northeast. Why? Because you have all year round, you have things growing and growing wildly in a tropical environment like that. Whereas in the Northeast, in the winter, things are dead. You're not doing a lot of landscaping, but you might get that picked up by snow plowing and snow removal. So you just need to look for those numbers. And then you need to be careful because if a particular year had a particularly heavy snowfall, let's say, then they might have a real higher expense for that snow plow, that snow removal in that year. When you look at previous years past, they didn't have as much. I don't know, 3,500, 4,200, and then 12,000. Well, what do? If it was me, I would make a note and go back to the historical norm of 3,000 or 4,000 and make a note of the anomaly in that one year and say, we don't expect this to continue. Again, I want you to be thinking of this. The goal is not just to go through the exercise. The goal is to be thinking, how can I maximize loan proceeds? How can I maximize the NOI? If I see an opportunity to legitimately, rationally support the idea of a lower expense item, I'm going to take it. That's a perfect example. Similarly, it could be hurricanes in Florida or tornadoes in somewhere in the Midwest, a mudslide in Los Angeles, whatever it is in that particular location. If you can explain away the fact that this doesn't happen continuously and often, it was a one-time event, then you can take it out. I'm just trying to think of other things that might be seasonal. Repair and maintenance might also be seasonal. There's more air conditioning repairs, which can be very expensive, especially for older properties where those units tend to break down continuously. And similar items depend what's in repair and maintenance. Payroll and G&A, I don't think they vary that much seasonally, but certainly, real estate tax, utilities, grounds, R&M will vary greatly depending on the time of the year that you're looking at the expense items. And so you want to keep that in mind. Hand. What does the hand symbolize? Well, just the fact that I used my hand is probably a good indication. There's a human element involved. Properties don't manage themselves. When I worked for the family office back in a while ago, the owner, the family, the patriarch of the family used to always say to the staff, he'd have a big holiday party and invite all the staff from all the different properties. So the property leasing managers and the property managers themselves would all come in. And he always would say this. He goes, everybody thinks that real estate is about the property, right? That's why people go into real estate. They're buying property. They fall in love with property, like to renovate the property. But it's not about the property. It's about the people who manage the property. It's about the people who lease the different units and sell to the tenants. He goes, it's you, the people, who make everything work and run efficiently. The rest of it's very easy. He used to say that almost every year, repeatedly, the same exact speech. And so it always makes you realize, although we're talking about tangible, hard assets, it's filled with a bunch of people, not just the ones that live and work there, meaning actually occupy the property, but the ones who manage the staff that run the property. And I want to look at that in two areas. I want to look at that in payroll, and I will look at that in property management. So let's start with payroll. Staff, and just what I mentioned a few minutes ago, there's probably a property manager or a team of property managers. There's going to be leasing staff who are in charge of renting out the different units. There's going to be repair and maintenance staff that are in charge of fixing different things on the property. And depending on the size of the property and the complexity of the property, you're going to have different repair and maintenance needs, different staffing needs. You'll see more recent trends to try to automate a lot of this, like self-storage, I think, is very much automated. Come in, you push a few buttons, gain access to the building, push a few more buttons, gain access to your unit. You don't really need any staff there anymore. It's completely automated with a camera. I think when you get to a property or a business like a hotel, you're going to see much more heavily staff intensive, although I've seen many now new technologies coming out to automate processes within a hotel. For example, not logging in, but I'm forgetting the term. When you come into the hotel for the first time, you go up to the lobby and have to check in. That's the word. Wow, I'm losing my mind. You check in at the hotel. Well, I've seen many hotels now where you don't go to the counter to check in. You walk over to a standing little booth or standing computer, and you punch in your information, your name, and your reservations right there. They print out and hand you your electronic key card, and you go right up to your room. You don't even talk to anybody. So payroll is really important. You're going to have to understand how the particular property that you're looking at is operating. And by the way, not just historically. This is an important point I've forgotten up to this point. You are looking at not just the historical. How has the property operated up to day one when the owner is taking over? Because what you want to present to the lenders or to the equity investors is, how are you going to operate the property? Perfect example is what we just talked about. It has been operating very manually. They have a sales staff, a check-in staff at the lobby, or when you first come into the apartment property, you have to go up and get your keys, whatever it might be. The new owner says, I'm going to change that. I'm going to automate that with a computerized system. So historically, you've had a higher expense for payroll. You're now going to show to the lenders or to the investors a lower expense item for payroll and maybe a new computer software item or computer equipment item. And you just need to be able to explain that and talk about that. But that's a perfect example where things are going to change literally on day one. And so you're going to have a historical underwriting of the expenses. You're going to have a day one operating, and then you're going to have a year one, year two, year three as you get towards stabilized. And you want to show that out. We always showed historical, kind of the previous 12 months, where we are in day one, and where we're going to be at year one, and then maybe out to stabilization depending on the property. It's just an important thing to talk about is regarding payroll and staff. Property management. Property management is the item that can drive you crazy. And especially in smaller properties where people think, or owners and operators think they're going to manage the property themselves. I used to see this all the time in New York on small properties. Small properties are still very expensive in Manhattan. There's no property management. What are they doing? There's an R&M number, there's a small repair and maintenance number, but there's literally no property management. Nobody ever looks at that property. And the reality is that there is only 5 units in the whole property, and the owner just kind of does it himself. Okay, but the reason property management is so important is like this. As you get to a more normal property, 5, 10, 15 units and large, and again, I'm particularly thinking of multifamily, but it applies in the same talks to other asset classes as well. As you get to larger properties, the lender is going to look at this and say, listen, it's great that you think you're going to self-manage the property, and maybe you're great at it. You're going to come in, you're going to clean everything, you're going to handle every lease, you're going to come around and you're going to collect the payments, right? You're going to go door to door to door, and you're going to collect the rent roll. Again, nowadays, most of that is done electronically. But the question, here's how the lenders are going to look at this. They're going to say, listen, if something happens to this deal with you, and we don't think it's going to, we think you're a great borrower, but if something was to go wrong, and we, the lender, need to step in, we're not going to be able to benefit from you as the property manager. We as the lender are certainly not going to manage the property ourselves. So we're going to have to bring in a third-party management company, and we're going to have to pay for that. So the lender is going to put in a management cost in their underwriting. Think of this. You, the owner or the borrower doesn't have much in the way of property management because it's their own time and they're not allocating their time in there. The lender comes here, and therefore your expenses are lower because there's almost a negligible item in property management, or maybe like I was describing a few minutes ago, it's non-existent. The lender comes in and essentially penalizes you by putting in a management number. And you're like, wait a minute, my owner-operator doesn't have a management. He's going to do it himself. And he's a really great manager. He's very, very efficient. And the lender says, that's nice. I'm still putting in 5% of effective gross income as your management, as your property management. And so you can argue that, and sometimes you win those battles, and sometimes you don't, depending on the situation, depending on the lender. But that very much is very important because property management expense can be expensive. It's typically 3, 4, 5% of the effective gross income. That's just typically the way it's measured. I know a lot of the third-party management companies, well, that's how they do it. They'll say, okay, our fee is 3% of EGI, effective gross income. Again, this is a completely negotiable item. It's going to be completely different on many different types of properties, whether it's an actual staff cost or it's a flat fee off of a percentage off of the income. But it's very real. Somebody needs to manage that property, whether they are selling and leasing the unit, whether they're just overseeing the operations of the property. Somebody is managing that property. And I'm not talking necessarily payroll. You could have a different item for property management than I'm thinking leasing staff. For me, property management is the one person who's in charge of me, like the overall. This might be I used to think of it like this. The property manager is the president of this property, right? Think about it like that. Every property is typically purchased under a separate LLC. The president of that LLC is the property manager. You might be an owner-operator, or the borrower might be the owner-operator, but the person overseeing the day-to-day operations is the property manager. They're essentially the president. And I think that's a great way to look at it. When you speak to different property managers, Do they realize they're the president of this organization, being 125 Main Street or whatever it is? That's the property manager. Other general staffing would go into payroll. Now, just along these lines, while we're here, sometimes you might have ground or repair and maintenance that have staff, right? There's a manager of maintenance. There's groundskeepers. Are those payroll costs and staffing costs buried within the items, the line items of grounds and R&M, or are they all contained within payroll? You just need to look at the numbers and, again, how was it historically, and how does the new purchaser, the borrower, how do they want to handle it? So that's why I have the hand here to remind you that there's a personal human element, more so thinking about property management because it so often gets overlooked and sometimes not even included, much more than I was thinking about payroll, but it certainly applies to thinking about the human element in both, because HR in many companies makes or breaks businesses. It always comes down to people. And the longer you're in business, you realize more and more, no matter what great widget they're selling, it's the people who are involved in the management, in the sales, in the support. The people make the difference in almost every business I've ever been involved in. Next, why the vault? Well, the vault is symbolizing capital reserves. And again, this often gets overlooked in smaller properties with mom and pop operators, but it's incredibly important, and lenders are very often going to make you include them. What's a capital reserve? Let me give you a perfect example. Every year we know there's a certain amount of the flooring that's going to need to be redone, or the roof is going to need to be redone. So we know that roughly every 10 years, or maybe it's 15 years or 20 years, the roofs are going to need to be redone. And every 5 years, the carpets in the hallways are going to need to be redone, and the lobby gets renovated every 3 years. Whatever it is, every property has characteristics that are not happening every year, but happening on a recurring basis over time. And so what we do is we allocate those into a reserve. So in multifamily, it's usually a per unit cost. We simply say, in general, multifamily in this particular region of the country, in this particular age of property, those are two big characteristics. Where is it located? Because different parts of the country have different wear and tear on different properties. How is it constructed? Is it a brick? Is it wood? Is it concrete poured? Whatever it might be, those two. And then you want to take into account the seasonal variances. Depending on where that's located, you're going to have different seasonal involvement. And then, so at the end of the day, you kind of cut back and say, okay, we're going to need $250 or $350 per unit per month in reserves. And you hold that back. And that is a real line item. And in multifamily, it's done just that way. We have a 50-unit property, $350 per unit in cap reserves. It's just in there, and it's held back. And if you don't do it very often, the lender's going to take it in as part of the escrow every month on the payment. And it's really important to put those in there. Now, this is where the property condition assessment, a PCA, property condition assessment, is a third-party report. So when you're going through the acquisition process on certainly a more commercial type of investment-grade property, the lenders are generally going to require you to get a PCA report, where an engineering group or some kind of professional PCA firm is going to go through the property and do just what I said. They're going to say, okay, the roofs are going to have to be done the roofs are already 15 years old. We expect that within the next 5 years, you're going to need to redo roofs. The fridges, fridges need to be replaced every 5 years. Ovens every 10 years. The tile or it could be carpet. Carpet needs to be replaced every 3 or 4 years. They're going to run those numbers for you, and they're going to back in using a discounted value model. They're going to back in to a number that should be your per unit capital reserves. If you're on a smaller property, you should still allocate something, because if you don't, then what happens is 3, 4, 5 years go by and the owner operator never saved and never put any money aside to redo the roofs or to redo the carpets or redo some of the kitchen elements or the boilers and the heating, the HVAC systems. And now they don't have the money to do that, right? So what happens? They get in trouble, right? And they have to go into cash out of their pocket and take it out of the bank and go ahead and make those payments. But the vault is the idea of putting the capital reserves aside each month, usually into a separate bank account. Very often when you go and acquire these properties, the lenders will say, okay, I want you to set up an account at our bank, one for the operating, one for security reserves on rent, and one for capital reserves that gets put aside and locked in there. And I think of it like a vault. So that's why I put the vault there. And just to do a quick rundown on all the items that I typically want to see in my analysis of expenses. Real estate tax, sorry, can't get away from it. Property insurance, you notice I'm saying with both of these items, it's not any kind of personal taxes. These are the real estate taxes that go to the property. Property insurance, again, it's not liability insurance. This is not D&O insurance. This is the property insurance for the property. Utilities, every property is going to have different utilities. Could be gas, could be oil, could be electric. Sometimes you're going to see cable and other expenses. Nowadays, you might have like Wi-Fi and ASP charges in here. It depends how utilities are going to be run. You might have a separate item for IT. You might have a separate item for computer equipment. Depends what's going to go in utilities. It doesn't really matter just as long as everything's allocated. Property management, we've spoken about already. Grounds, landscaping. Again, this could be everything from regular, when we think of landscaping, to snow removal, to anything that's particular to a particular environment in the area. R&M, repair and maintenance, another really important number, often quite large. Often depends on the age of the property. Older properties tend to need more work. Newer properties, you probably don't have much R&M in the first few years at all if it was a recently constructed property. Payroll, we spoke about that. G&A, general and administrative, it's my catch-all for everything else. This could be your professional services, your accounting, your legal. It could be, your pest removal, although you might put that in repairs or in utilities or grounds. It could really be anything that goes into here. Sometimes there might be travel expenses if they're going to different conferences. You might send your apartment managers to go to an apartment association conference. Whatever that is, that all gets, phones might be in here, right? So everything goes in here. And that's your general list. There could be others. Again, every property is different. It's hard to have one list that captures everything. But these are the items you should be thinking about and be aware of and be looking for. And again, if this is interesting and you want to take a deeper dive into this, because this is clearly not a spreadsheet where I can really run these numbers and show you what they look like on paper, take a look in the comments down below to become part of the 8Cap Academy. And that's it. So thank you very much for watching. Hope this helps and look forward to seeing you on the next video.